speaker tonight. No doubt all of you believe that I'm of Scottish descent, which I am, with a name like Fraser. But as I told the group at Fort Augustus last night, having a Scottish surname does not rule out the possibility of having Irish blood through intermarriage. And when I look into my own family tree, I find that I may also be of Irish descent through my great-grandmother, who was a singleton. And at the moment we're endeavoring to prove whether or not the singletons did come from Ireland. It's a quite common name in England as well, but you never know. I may just find some of my forebears there as well. In addition, I'm interested in the Irish especially because being the coordinator at the Prince Edward Island Museum and Heritage Foundation at the genealogical collection there, I have a very strong interest in the background of all islanders. So I'm very interested in your Irish heritage. Tonight I'd like to briefly discuss the history of the Irish from Prince Edward Island, and then I'd like to discuss at some length how you begin to trace your family history. And we're going to look first at how you trace your family history right here on Prince Edward Island. We'll be examining the principles of genealogical research, and we'll be examining the resources that are available. And after we have a break, I'm going to briefly introduce you to doing genealogical research in Ireland. One thing you should keep in mind is that this lecture tonight has been tailored for beginners, so some of the more experienced researchers who are here tonight will likely find that I'm discussing areas that you already know about. But I hope some of the information that I'll be presenting tonight will be useful to you. The history of the Irish on Prince Edward Island is particularly fascinating, and until recently it was a much neglected one. And since 1977, through organizations such as the PEI Irish Heritage Society and the Benevolent Irish Society, which goes way back to 1883 when it was incorporated, through these organizations there has been and continues to be a very successful movement to create awareness of Irish cultural history. And the three issues of the Alouette Review, focusing on the Irish, the annual Irish Folk Festival, the annual Irish Lecture Series, and Brendan O'Grady's project of indexing Irish immigrants to Prince Edward Island have all contributed to this awareness. So as we begin to think about tracing our ancestors, a cultural awareness of our history is very important. Therefore, we should briefly examine the role that PEI history has played in shaping the lives of our Irish ancestors. This takes us back to the year 1767, the year of the infamous lottery on PEI. That's the year that the modern history of the island really began. 3 years earlier, Surveyor General Captain Samuel Holland had begun his survey of Prince Edward Island, which was completed in 1765. And as directed by the Crown in England, Holland had divided the island into 3 counties, Prince County, Kings County, and Queens County. He also divided it into 14 parishes and 67 townships of approximately 20,000 acres each. Parish reserves were established and 3 county towns were named, Princetown, Charlottetown, and Georgetown. And of course, as we all know, Charlottetown later became the capital of the colony. In 1767, the names of the 67 chosen applicants, who had earned rewards for their political or military services, were put in a box and drawn in turn. And this lottery took place in London, and the townships were assigned in order as the names were drawn. So the 67 townships thereafter became nicknamed lots, and even today we usually refer to the townships on Prince Edward Island as lots. Few of the men's names that were drawn ever had any personal interest in the island, nor did they succeed in colonizing the land in accordance with the terms of their grants. And the land question, with its familiar features of absentee landlords, oppressive and dishonest land agents, and abused tenants, became the island's main domestic problem for over 100 years. And it wasn't until the Land Purchase Acts of 1853 and 1875, whereby the government bought the land from the individual proprietors and resold it to the tenants, that the problem eventually was solved. Back in 1769, the island of St. John, as Prince Edward Island was then called, was made a separate colony for Nova Scotia and was granted the right to form its own administration with its own government and to appoint its own officials. And this included the rector of the Anglican Church. And at that time, the Anglican Church was the only established church in the colony. Walter Patterson was appointed the first governor of the colony, and Patterson strongly supported the 1780 Act of the General Assembly, altering the name of the island of St. John to that of New Ireland. And it's for that, I think, that the Irish remember him most fondly. However, the Act was not approved by the Privy Council in London, so it never met with the King's consent, and it never officially became law. For the Irish, landlordism was one problem, but another issue that was very prevalent at the time was religious discrimination. When the lots were distributed to the 67 grantees, one of the conditions attached to the land grants in regard to settlement stipulated that the settlers only be Protestants and that the settlers were not to come from any of His Majesty's dominions, including Ireland. They could come from America if they had lived in America 2 years prior to when the grants were given out. The Irish settlers on Prince Edward Island were not part of any massive colonization effort, although at irregular intervals they were recruited by proprietors or their agents, and the most notable instance being the 1830s influx of County Monaghan families to the MacDonald lands in Fort Augustus. In an article by Brendan O'Grady, who I'm sure most of you know here tonight, he told us that on plan as immigration from Ireland to Prince Edward Island generally was, the Irish arrivals may be divided into three groups: the colonial pioneers from 1767 to 1810, the southeastern immigrants from 1810 to 1830, and the Monaghan settlers from 1830 to 1850. The colonial pioneers, for the most part, were an elite group whose function was to establish British law and British institutions here, and to ensure that the island would be a loyal Protestant colony. While they weren't the most numerous, they were perhaps the most influential of the settlers during the 1767 to 1810 period. And among the elite were administrative officials, business agents and entrepreneurs, land speculators, military personnel, and a clergyman. But the total Irish community also included farmers, fishermen, shipwrights, tradesmen, and laborers. Many of the Irish clustered right here in the Charlottetown area, while others scattered around to the other areas on the island that were being settled at that time. The 1798 census, though incomplete, accounted for 4,372 people, and considering only the surnames of heads of families, Dr. O'Grady tells us that at least 50 or perhaps up to 80 of the 784 families appear to be distinctly of Irish origin. So there were quite a number of Irish here back in 1798. Dr. O'Grady also tells us that the heaviest influx of Irish settlers occurred in the two 20-year waves between 1810 and 1850. Now, I'm just going to turn on the slide projector. I don't know if my cord will allow me to do that. Perhaps if George can get it there for me, please. And I think it might go one notch further, George, possibly? Okay, great. Thanks very much. Okay, the 1810 to 1830 wave of southeastern immigrants brought people principally from the southeastern colonies of Wexford, Waterford, Kilkenny, and Tipperary. So that was down in this section here of Ireland that they were coming from, mainly from those four counties there. The post-1830 wave, the Monaghan settlers brought immigrants from such northern counties as Armagh, Tyrone, and especially Monaghan. And you can see that Monaghan is highlighted there in the green, and the other counties are just around that, bordering Monaghan. These 19th century Irish settlers to Prince Edward Island were overwhelmingly Catholic. In another article that Dr. O'Grady has written on the Monaghan settlers in the spring '83 issue of the Aberwet Review, he very clearly outlines the history of the Monaghan people here, and I encourage you to read that article. I've brought with me all the issues of the Aberwet Review that concentrate on the Irish. This slide shows a close-up of County Monaghan divided into its baronies and locating its principal towns. And the areas that most people came to the island from are these areas that are shaded in green. And this slide shows names of County Monaghan's most numerous families and approximate locations of the families. Many of these families are found on PEI today, especially in the Fort Augustus area, and I'm sure some of you that are here tonight have the surnames that are listed there. This map of Prince Edward Island illustrates the general distribution of County Monaghan settlers. They settled in the Kincora district up west and in the Kelly's Cross and Emmyville areas, and on the eastern side of the Hillsborough River, they settled in a stretch from Fort Augustus to Montague. And close to 40% of the Irish in Prince Edward Island originate from Monaghan County. And PEI has the largest Monaghan colony in the country, so it is quite significant. Well, what shipping routes did the Irish immigrants to PEI follow? They varied quite a bit. Some ships came directly to Prince Edward Island, but many came via Newfoundland from ports such as Waterford, Cork, Belfast, Liverpool, and Glasgow. This map shows an important trade and passenger route from the port of Waterford to Canada. And many of the ships stopped at Newfoundland because it was the closest landing point on this side of the Atlantic. Some of the ships would then sail on to one or more of the maritime provinces, and some of them even went on to the New England states. Unfortunately, there are no official passenger lists in existence of Irish immigrants to the island, so it makes it difficult to document just when people arrived here. This map of Atlantic Canada shows the shipping routes at this end, and again emphasizing the important Newfoundland connection. And as you can see, there are a variety of routes. Some left St. John's and came down to Halifax area, others came to the Pictou area, some came directly to PEI, a number of them went directly to the Miramichi area, and some also went to the Sydney area of Cape Breton. So one thing you should remember when you go looking for your ancestors, you may not be going directly back to Ireland. You may have to go to one of these places on the mainland, to the Miramichi area, to the Halifax area, and trace your relatives while they lived there, because some of them did settle in the other areas first. And I know some of them, when they came across the Atlantic, they were so glad to finally see shore that they got off the boats, and some of them vowed they'd never get on a boat again, and settled in Newfoundland for quite a few years, but then later on they would move on to other locations. So that's something to consider, and I think I heard one lady saying as I came in tonight that her relatives lived in the Miramichi area of New Brunswick before they came here. At least 25% of Ireland's 32 counties are known to be represented here on Prince Edward Island, and almost all of the Irish settlers who came to Prince Edward Island were poor, except for the elite who arrived as part of the colonial pioneers from 1767 to 1810. A few others in later years possessed modest means, but for the most part, they were generally poor. Often the farmers who were farming in Ireland, they would sell their land and sell all their livestock just to get enough money to pay their passage out to the new country. Economic problems and overpopulation were the main motivating factors that caused the Irish immigrants to leave their homeland. However, most of the Irish immigrants to Prince Edward Island came prior to the Great Famine, which began in 1845 and continued until 1848, 1849 as the result of the repeated potato crop failures. And Dr. O'Grady reminds us that it's therefore a mistaken notion to think that people on Prince Edward Island are descendants of famine victims. While there may be a few that are descendants from the famine victims, most of the Irish people on the island were here before the Great Famine occurred. In the early 1840s, before the Great Famine, many Irish everywhere were involved in the repeal movement against the Act of Union of 1801. The Act had immersed the Dublin Parliament with the British Parliament at Westminster. And the repeal movement was very active here on PEI as well among the Irish immigrants. And meetings were held at places such as Fort Augustus, Watervale, Kensington, and Bedeck. And the names of 150 island repealers were reported in a Halifax newspaper. The birthplaces of the repealers are usually also given. So sometimes you'll find out the county in Ireland where these people came from. So for some of you, some of your relatives may be listed on this repeal list. And it has been published in issue 24 of the Island magazine. And I believe I have it in my on the table of books there tonight for you to look at. When the 1848 census of Prince Edward Island was taken, a total of 6,407 Irish-born people were living on PEI. And this map shows where the people were living at that time. I don't know if you can see from where you're sitting, but in each lot there's a number representing how many Irish-born people were living there at that time. The largest number are in the Lot 36 area, which would be the Fort Augustus area where the Monaghan settlers came to. But one thing to keep in mind that at that time there were many other people living on the island who had Irish connections. They were descendants of Irish immigrants. By 1881, 23% of the island's population were of Irish ethnic background, compared with 21% in 1921 and 19% in 1951. Today, the Irish constitute at least 20% of Prince Edward Island's population, and perhaps 1/3 of our people have at least one Irish ancestor. Well, in this brief overview of the history of the Irish in Prince Edward Island, I've really only touched on the surface, but I hope it's whet your appetite, and I'm sure if you're here tonight that you're all very interested in your Irish heritage. Some of the best reading material on Prince Edward Island's Irish is in the 3 special issues of the Aberystwyth Review, which I mentioned before, so I really encourage you to read these if you haven't already. And Father Bolger's History of PEI, Canada's Smallest Province, and Lauren Colbeck's History, Cradle of Confederation, they're both good histories to give you a general background of history right here in Prince Edward Island. And in several issues of the Island magazine, you'll find articles that relate to the Irish and sometimes to the conditions in the old country. There's an article by John Cousins, I believe, where he includes a letter that someone wrote from Ireland during the Great Famine, telling someone here on the island what the conditions were really like. So it's very interesting. That one especially, and the repeal lists are very interesting. Well, as I've been emphasizing, genealogy and history are interrelated, and very often the genealogist must be an historian in order to weigh and evaluate information properly. History may be described as a record of the people and past events of importance to society, the interpretation of these events and the patterns formed by them. But genealogy is often defined too narrowly as the record of descent from the earliest known forebear, or some people simply define it as family history. And there's a definition that I prefer. It's been formulated by Terry Punch from Nova Scotia. Some of you may hear him on the CBC radio talk show that he has about once a month, where he answers genealogy questions. And Mr. Punch defines genealogy as the art or science of tracing and recording the family relationships of people on the basis of sufficient identification. It is an art in that it is concerned with human beings within an historical context, and it is a science in that it proceeds along lines of hypotheses and conclusion, deductive reasoning, and has its own peculiar terminology. So that's getting pretty technical, and we don't want to scare anyone with that definition, but I just want you to know about that definition, so if anyone tries to tell you that genealogy is a useless hobby whereby all you do is collect the names and dates of dead ancestors, you have something to throw back at them. Genealogy is gradually becoming recognized as a valued, useful, and professional study, and carefully researched and well-documented genealogies are gaining the respect of many professionals in the academic community, who are now realizing just how helpful genealogical records can be with their work. And I'll just give you a few examples. We have doctors who are involved in genetic studies. We have lawyers who are trying to settle estates, or they're working on settling land disputes or something like that. We have historians documenting history, and we have demographers who are studying people living within a certain geographic area. So all of these people are starting to realize that the records of genealogists can be very, very helpful. So there shouldn't be any doubt that genealogy is an important and a beneficial study. And it's a study for people of all ages, which often bridges the communication gaps within the generations of a family, particularly within the generations of a family. To begin doing genealogical research, you don't need any specialized training. Interest, however, is a very important requirement, and while a formal education may be helpful, it doesn't replace good common sense and the ability to look at information objectively. That's really what it takes, good basic common sense, because as I said last night at Fort Augustus, we see people coming into genealogy all the time, some of them very well educated. They don't seem to have any common sense at all when it comes to records, because they'll come to the door and start demanding that we pass them their genealogy, and they think that's all there's to it, and they should know better. Genealogy is a very time-consuming hobby. It requires patience, it requires perseverance, but you're bound to enjoy it. And one person recently said to me it took him 10 years to do his family history. He said, it'll take the rest of my life to live it down. So he was taking it very lightheartedly, but he realized that genealogy took a long time. It does take, Angus Baxter says, who's a well-known genealogist from overseas, it takes approximately 10 years to do a well-documented genealogy. Well, how do you begin to trace your family history? There is really only one way to begin, and that is to start with yourself and work back generation by generation. It's usually impossible to begin your research with someone who was born 200 years ago in Ireland and try to work forward from that person to you. It just won't work. So take my advice. Trace back from the known to the unknown. You must research very carefully on this side of the Atlantic before you have any hope of finding your family overseas. In the early stages, you must do your genealogical homework, and this involves gathering all known information from family and community sources. Names, dates, and places are very, very important. You'll find that people are your greatest genealogical resource, so you should communicate with all your relatives, especially the older ones, and neighbors who live near early family homesteads. Contact them in person, or if they live a distance away, write them a letter. or call them on the telephone. If they're not one of those long-winded relatives, you might do that and end up with a bill less than $20. But if they are the ones who love to talk and talk, a letter would be a safer means. But the data you collect from relatives is often one of the best ways to flesh out your family history. You should try to not only learn the names, dates, and places, but try to learn what your forebears looked like, what they owned, their occupation, what role religion played in their lives, and how they celebrated special events, because this makes your relatives come alive. And it's not just a boring genealogy talking about great-great-grandmother who begat somebody and so on. You should search through family papers such as Bibles, which may contain birth, marriage, and death information, scrapbooks, which may contain newspaper clippings and other mementos, photograph albums, which help put faces to names and often record special family events such as weddings or christenings, and letters and diaries may also contain some very helpful information. Does anyone in your family have legal papers such as wills or deeds or military records? And can you locate any marriage or baptismal certificates, school or Sunday school records? If you can, examine all of these very, very carefully because they'll be really helpful to you. It's amazing if you go up into the attic of some of the older homes on the island, or even in the attic of some of the less older homes on the island. I can think of my parents' home, which is only about 30 years old, and the interesting things I found up there when I've gone snooping. You'll really find a lot of information about your family. Quite often you'll find some of these things, old photograph albums, old scrapbooks, old newspaper clippings, and they really can tell you a lot of information. So go looking and see what's there. Of course, ask permission before you do that, because you may be on a little bit of sensitive ground if you don't. But if you come across this information, make sure that it's looked after. We hear all too often of information that ends up in a garbage heap somewhere, and it's lost forever. You should also read any community or church histories that are published for the area where your forebears lived, as these often contain helpful information. As well, you should read a provincial or a national history to give you some idea of the political, economic, and social setting in which your forebears lived. And in the handouts that I've given you tonight, we've included a couple of little pamphlets that center in on doing genealogical research here on the island. You should record everything you find. Keep notes, photographs, photocopies, or tapes of as much of this information as possible, stating who you received every last detail from, and put the place and the date. Because without a source, information can't be verified. And I think we all know how frustrating it is to get a piece of information, and you may write it down in June. Come December, you'll try and find out, or you'll try to remember, where did I get that information? And you won't be able to remember, and it can be very frustrating. So put the date and the year on the newspaper clipping you cut out. Identify all your sources, and it'll save you time and save your sanity in the long run. Most people, when they start to do genealogical research, use charts to organize the information that they gather. And the two basic types of charts used are this one, the pedigree chart, and the family group sheet. Now, you may have seen versions of these before, but they all basically contain the same information. The pedigree chart starts right here with you, and the top part of the page is for your father's family, the lower part of the page is for your mother's family. So you fill in the information that you know for your father, for your grandparents. You get into your two sets of great-grandparents in this column, and back here you're way back to your great-great-grandparents. Some people on the island can even go back further than that. So if you can, start another sheet for them. You do the same thing with your mother's family, and fill in the information that you know for them, when they were born, when they were married, and if they've died, fill in that information as well. This chart gives you a general overview of your family, and it's very important because we often find at work that people will come in and start telling us about their family, and they'll get their great-grandmother mixed up as being the wife of their great-great-grandfather or something like that. And it can get very confusing for them and very confusing for us. This way, on one page, you have an overview of your family, your direct line of descent, and hopefully you'll eliminate that problem. The family group sheet is used for one family unit, a husband and wife on the top section, and then the lower section is used for any children that they may have. And again, fill in the information that you know for them. You'll also make up another sheet for each one of the children who marry. So you're going to need a lot of these sheets. I have about 3 binders full of these sheets myself. I know someone up east on the island who claims to have 27 binders. So his relatives have really been busy over the years. We suggest that you only work on one family at a time because it gets far too confusing and overwhelming to be working on several families at once. So just work on your father's line when you begin. Don't work on both your father's and mother's line, or start just on your mother's and leave your father's till later. You should read a good genealogy guide for the province or area where your forebears lived. Unfortunately, the one for this province is now out of print. We have a picture of the copy of the cover of it here, and we do have a few copies left at work. It's a good basic general guide, and we are in the process of writing and compiling a new guide. Until that time, we're using the pamphlets that we've given you tonight. Okay, having completed all your initial genealogical homework, you'll likely still have many blanks to fill in on your pedigree and family group sheets. So now, armed with your NDPs, as we call them, or your names, dates, and places, you should be ready to visit island repositories. And we suggest that the first place that you visit is the genealogy room of the Prince Edward Island Museum and Heritage Foundation, which is located at 2 Kent Street in Charlottetown. And this is a picture of Beaconsfield here. At Beaconsfield, we have the largest collection of genealogical material regarding island families in the province. And although we have the largest room in the house, we can only accommodate from 12 to 16 researchers at one time. So we always encourage people to come early in the day to ensure getting a seat, especially in the summertime when we're really, really busy with a lot of tourists coming in. I know people like Mrs. Simmett could tell you all about how busy the room can get at times and how hectic it can get. During October to May, the room is open from Monday to Friday from 10 to 12 in the morning and from 1:15 to 5 in the afternoon. And we're also open Wednesday evenings by appointment. During the summer, our hours are revised slightly. We're open from 9 to 12 in the morning and 1:15 to 4 in the afternoon. And there is a $3 admission charge each day you use the room. We're responsible for generating so much revenue within our department, so unfortunately we do have to charge for using the room. But if you are a member of the Prince Edward Island Genealogical Society or the Museum and Heritage Foundation, admission is free, and you can come in as often as you want for no charge. The Genealogy Division is basically a resource center designed to save you many hours of searching through original records, such as census returns and cemetery transcriptions and newspapers and things like that. Our Master Name Index is an index of approximately 650,000 cards, which was compiled as we index these records: census records, passenger lists, newspapers, cemetery transcriptions, marriage record books, and many, many other materials. And back in 1979, we indexed, or we transcribed rather, with the help of students under a Young Canada Works project, all 300 cemeteries on Prince Edward Island. And the information on each stone was copied down and later put on cards in the Master Name Index under all surnames mentioned on the stone. And this is a sample card here in our index drawer, and they're filed numerically by the lot or township number, which is given in the upper left-hand corner. So this is how the inscription actually appeared, we hope, if the transcription has been taken down properly. If you're wondering what the slashes mean at the end of the lines, it indicates the end of a line on a tombstone. This map, which hangs in the genealogy room, shows the island's 67 lots, and each pink pin represents a cemetery. So as you can see, that there are cemeteries that are fairly close together on the island. Tombstones can give very valuable genealogical information, such as this one here. We see it tells us that Samuel Lane died in June 1881. He was age 78 at that time. He immigrated from Mount Mellick, Queens County, Ireland, with his parents in 1819. So just think how much genealogy that tells you right there. Then about his wife, Elizabeth Lodge, it tells you when she died, the age she was at when she died, and it also tells you that she was a native of Yorkshire in England. Now, there are a number of the early stones that will give you valuable genealogical information like this. The only thing to remember is that the information on the stones is not always accurate, because the stones were often put up several years after somebody had passed away. And people get asking each other, well, when was our grandmother born, or when was her mother or father born? And they try to remember the right date, and sometimes they don't hit the nail on the head. So that's how you often get misinformation on a stone. Sometimes on a stone, too, you'll only find the name of one person given. If you know, for instance, your great-grandparents were buried in a particular cemetery, you might only find your grandfather's name on the stone. And that may be because his wife died, and then nobody bothered to put her name on the tombstone. So just because her name isn't on the stone doesn't mean that she isn't buried there. Many of the early settlers who came to Prince Edward Island couldn't afford stones, so that's another thing to remember too. When you go to a cemetery, you're not going to find a stone for everyone who's been buried there. And in the early years, they often used sandstones, or they just put up a wooden marker. And after a few years, the wooden markers would simply rot away. And with the sandstones, the inscriptions would often weather off. And even if we look at some of the other stones, you can see after 100 years or so the effects of weathering, which makes the inscriptions really difficult to read. Well, getting back to the Master Name Index, all of the other cards in the index are filed alphabetically, and much of it chronologically also. We've indexed a number of census returns. We've indexed them for the early French period, also with the first English census in 1798, right up through to 1891. There was one 1798, 1841, 48, 61, 71, 81, and 1891. The 91 is the most recent one to be released. Statistics Canada is holding all the census information since then as confidential, because some of the people who are listed, say, in the 1901 census, quite a number of people are still living, and they feel it might be an invasion of their privacy. This card here is from our index drawer, and it's for the 1861 census. And with all the census records prior to 1881, they only listed the name of the head of the household. And they did, however, list the ages, approximate ages, and the sex of each member in the household. So it does give you an idea of how many people were in the family at that time. But it would be very nice to have all their names as well. You can see in the lower left-hand corner the breakdown that they give there. It also tells you the occupation of the head of the household. And this section is a very interesting section because it tells you the origin of the family. It's usually accurate, but sometimes it's inaccurate. Again, because misinformation may have been given to the census enumerator. So in this household, it looks like 2 people were born in Ireland, the rest were born in Prince Edward Island. The religion was Roman Catholic. They're living in Lot 25 area, and they have 20 years have expired on their lease of 999 years. So they may have been there for 20 years, or somebody else may have been there ahead of them. But on that particular property, there's been somebody for 20 years. The section on health is something that we get often asked by people, what does that refer to? And I think the order of the coding goes like this: deaf and dumb, blind, not vaccinated, and insane. So you can see in this household we have 6 people who are not vaccinated. When you see 6 in the last column under the insane column, then, well, sometimes if you're interpreting it for a researcher, you might tend to mix up the order because they might tend to get upset. Don't think I've ever seen 6 people insane in a household, but I've come across sometimes 2 or 3. Now they're labeled as insane. Whether we would consider them insane in today's terms or not, birth of each individual. So it's far more helpful. Now you're likely able to identify whether or not this Felix Murphy is your ancestor. With the other earlier census, it might be questionable because you might find that there were 3 or 4 Felix Murphys living in Lot 25. Felix is not really a common first name, but as you all know, Murphy's a very, very common Irish surname. And if you came across John Murphy or something like that, Donald Murphy, you might find as many as 10 or a dozen, something like that. So with this census, you can possibly identify your family. The 1891 census, which is the last one we have, includes another feature that this one doesn't. It tells us the relationship of each individual to the head of the household. So in the 1891 census, we'd be able to determine, for instance, if Susan was actually the wife of Felix, and if these other individuals were the children. Sometimes you'll assume that someone is a child of a couple because of their age, and you'll find out that they're a niece or a nephew or something like that. Sometimes you'll have servants living in a household too, and that may leave you with some questions. We've also indexed many island newspapers, and any surnames that have been mentioned, we've made up an index card for those. And with this one here, it's a newspaper reference to Felix Murphy from the Summerside Journal, and it's referring to his death. He died of Freetown after an illness of long duration, and it goes on to tell us where he came from in the old country, which is very, very important. So again, you can see how a newspaper can be a very important source to tell you about the origin of your forebears, to tell you where they were born. It also tells us, I believe, I'm finding it hard to read from this angle, but tells us that he left a wife and he left some children as well. And if you were to actually go to the newspaper, which is on microfilm at the libraries in Charlottetown, you might find that there was even more information given about the family. We've tried to extract the genealogically pertinent material, but it's always good to check the newspaper itself to see if any more information is given. We have a separate card index to baptismal records prior to 1886, and these have been compiled from the Prince Edward Island Department of Vital Statistics from all known to be existing church records. And this is a sample index card. We have Felix Murphy in this household. I think if we go back, let's just go back to that census card for a moment. Okay, we have a Felix Murphy in this household who's about age 19 in 1881. So the baptismal card that we have ahead here, this may possibly be referring to the same child. Although it might be out a year or two in age, it could be referring to the same child. And the baptismal records are very important because often they can get you back one further generation. If you know a Felix Murphy was born in 1860, but you don't know who his parents were, this may get you back. And it also usually tells the maiden name of the mother. And that's very important because that's something that is often very difficult to find out, what the maiden name of the mother was. Down in the bottom of the record, you see the name of the church where the record was originally extracted from.